Hello, uh, my name is Arturo Lopez Levy. I lead a program in Spanish in which we discuss issues of Latin America, Cuba, etc., and also US policy towards the region and other topics of international relations. Typically, I do this program in Spanish because I have basically an audience of people that speak that language. But this is something that is happening in parallel to the presidential race in the United States. And I want to share with you something that for me is surprising that not a lot of people has catch that in Fox TV we have a presentation by Cuban American Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar that is simply a, a fiction story. She's recommending, she's the chairman of the subcommittee for hemispheric affairs, and she's recommending policy to the business, to the Biden administration, and accusing uh, Vice President Harris of not doing something that, according to her, Reagan did, but Reagan never did. So we have this type of lack of professionalism in which people talk about foreign policy issues based on imagination. It's like people that they can come and they say things like equivalent in American culture as Elvis is still alive. Well, you don't have any evidence for that. You basically make up that story. And in my view, this is really, really dangerous because those people are the ones that look to be in the or look to have the upper hand in an eventual Trump administration if former President Trump win in November. And I think it's worrisome because foreign policy, and particularly foreign policy towards Latin America, is something that should be assumed, studied, discussed in a serious way. So let's see what is the issue that I want to present to you. I'm going to show a video in which Maria Elvira Salazar recommend to the Biden administration to do something that, according to her, Reagan did, a phone call that there is no evidence in any archive anywhere in the world that we know. I don't know, perhaps in the afterworld or in another dimension it might have happened, but not in the world of American diplomacy, and not with Daniel Ortega. And I'm going to tell you why this is essentially a make-up story. Let's watch it.
Administration, they're solely responsible for what's happening in Venezuela right now. Venezuelans said that if Maduro stays in power, 4 million more Venezuelans are going to be knocking on our southern border. 4 million more people. All right. So Biden signed an accord with Maduro saying, we are going to allow Chevron to sell your oil so that you can have more money in your pocket if you accept the results of the presidential election. So now they're selling oil and they have $1.5 billion in their pockets in the last few months, and they did not respect the results of the presidential election.
So what do you think?
First of all, there is no evidence of this conversation with Biden and Maduro, in which Biden allegedly, according to her, told that to Maduro in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, that the Biden administration motivation for allowing Chevron exploit oil resources from Venezuela. Now this congresswoman is making the story that Chevron and Biden were interested in in a free and fair election in Venezuela. It might be the case, but they basically, what they say to Maduro is, we are going to allow Chevron go there and exploit the oil fields in exchange for the elections. It's more complex than that. We are living in a very complex energy situation in the world. The oil prices are in the roof, and we know that Venezuela is a major producer of oil that is using its capacity far below its capabilities of exporting oil to the world market. Why is that? Well, because we have a war in the Middle East, and we have, more importantly, the war in Ukraine. And this has created major distraction in the oil flows and a lot of uncertainty. And it is in the national interest of the United States to bring more oil to the market. And obviously, it's on the values of the United States, on the dignity of an American democratic great power to promote free and fair elections all over the world. But there is no formal agreement on this, and there was no conversation. And Biden didn't say anything about that to Maduro, or Maduro say something like he agreed on that. There might be an implicit gentleman agreement, but this is something that we need basically to study, to look what was the type of signal that was sent. And I think that's an important part of this. But that's not the main problem with Maria Elvira Salazar. The main problem is not about what is happening now, that probably is happening as a back channel. Is that she create a conversation that is impossible that ever take place. According to her, we will see it's a conversation between President Reagan and Nicaraguan dictator president at that time, and later Daniel Ortega. Not a policy that functioned very well, because it made the Sandinistas a victim of intervention. But let's look at how, according to her, some magic phone call from President Reagan liberated Nicaragua. Let's listen what Maria Elvira has to say.
I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris should do at this moment.
Same thing that Ronald Reagan did in 1989 when the Sandinistas were giving free and fair elections and they lost. You picked up the phone and you said you signed an accord. We, the United States, were telling you that you have to commit.
You see it. You pick up the phone and you launch a tirade against the other person that is on the other side of the line. And in this case, the person who grabbed the phone is Ronald Reagan, that, according to her, called Daniel Ortega and told him, you sign an agreement with the United States about free and fair election, and you need now to honor that. Let's listen what Ms. Salazar tells us.
The states were telling you that you have to commit to and fulfill what you committed to. And that's it. And then say to Chevron and to Repsol and to all the oil industries that are there, you got to pause. No more selling of oil.
Okay, let's listen it, because I think this is important, the way she present that she's very assertive on saying that was what happened, that President Reagan did that. I'm going to tell you now how it's impossible that what she is creating out of her imagination happened.
Sandinistas were giving free and fair elections.
Just 1 second. I'm going to put it from the beginning, okay? The question is, what should President Biden or Vice President, she don't want to criticize. She knows that it has been the case that a lot of people has accused Republican surrogates of criticizing but not having a proposal. Well, she wants to criticize and also come with a proposal. The big problem is that she's coming with a proposal based on historical evidence that no historian has ever found, and that nobody ever knew that happened except Maria Elvira. Perhaps Nancy Reagan or President Ronald Reagan, before they died, they called her just to tell her something, or Mr. Ortega. She was close at a time to someone that was the ambassador of Ortega in the United States, but it looks now that move it to the right. She wants to tell us about something that no one in this world knew about it. The famous phone call that now the Republican Congresswoman from District 27 in Florida has discovered. It will be a contribution to the history of the Cold War if it ever happened. But let me tell you that if even Reagan or Ortega told her that, they were confused. I don't think that they did it, but I'm going to tell you why it doesn't. It's not possible that something like she is recommending to do or emulating ever happened.
Same thing that Ronald Reagan did in 1989 when the Sandinistas were giving free and fair elections and they lost. You pick up the phone and you said you signed an accord. We, the United States, were telling you that you have to commit to and fulfill what you committed to. And that's it. And then say to Chevron and to Repsol and to all the oil industries that are there, you got to pause. No more selling of oil, no more money to the repressive apparatus, no more money to Maduro. And I am sure that Maduro will negotiate with Biden and Harris. It's just that that phone call has not been made. And the message that we're sending to the rest of the world, Latin America, the Middle East, is that the White House is weak on dictators. Period. That's the message.
That's the message. That's the way to solve the problem, according to Maria Elvira Salazar. Let me tell you now why this story of the phone call is simply an absurd lie. First of all, President Reagan finished his presidency in 1989. So according to her, the call by President Reagan was in 1989. Well, President Reagan might be able to, that he might have been able to make the phone call between January 1st and January 20 in 1989. So let's not overstretch that. It might be that she's not fantasizing. It's simply that it happened in the last 20 days of his presidency. Well, I doubt it because President Reagan was not in his best shape at that time. But there is another problem, is that the election that, according to her, happened, that President Ortega lost the election to opposition candidate of the Unión Nacional Opositora, Violeta Chamorro, didn't happen in 1988, didn't happen in 1989. Those elections happened in 1990. So notice what is the type of creation that our new historian Salazar is telling us, that in 1989, between January 1st and January 20, President Reagan anticipated that there will be, or forecasted that there will be an election in 1990, and in this election, President Ortega will lose the election, or would have lost the election, and he will try to resist the election. And then he called him almost 2 years in advance and say something, you already lost election. How is possible that someone in 1989 tells someone that lost an election in 1990 that you already lost election and you are trying not to honor a commitment with the United States that nobody knows where it was? And this is the problem with this type of fantasies, that they began to talk about a foreign policy that cannot exist because this world is not real. That's why Mrs. Salazar has suggested to apply a no-fly zone in Ukraine and shut down planes, in Russian planes, in the same way America did in Libya. It's very interesting that the chairwoman of a committee about hemispheric subcommittee on hemispheric relations cannot find the difference between President Putin and President Gaddafi. They might be dictators, but they are dictators in a different way. One, let me remind the chairwoman is seated on nuclear weapons, and the whole world can go in flames. The other was a minor dictator with a lot of oil, but in Libya. So it's part of a habit. Mrs. Salazar also has said that in Cuba there is no private sector. Why she said that? Because according to her, all the private sector is controlled by the Cuban government. People who are able to travel to Cuba, despite the insistence of Mrs. Salazar on not allowing a social libertarian value, that is the freedom to travel. Let me remind you that Americans are not free to travel to Cuba, while the main problem for a Cuban to come to the United States is get a visa. The problem for an American is to get a license to go to Cuba. President Obama, that is almost the great monster, the ogre in Mrs. Salazar's point of view, was the one that, in line with American values, did something that was really real. He created a porous system of licenses to travel to Cuba, and this played a major role empowering the private sector. But in the world in which Ronald Reagan called Mr. Ortega 2 years in advance for something that nobody knew, Mr. Obama, who had based his policy in real facts, it's someone that deserves repudiation, like Biden, like Harris, like everyone else, because they don't do or they don't make a phone call that it never happened. Reagan did never call Ortega. This phone call is just in the mind of Mrs. Salazar dreams.